Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to welcome you to the Union of Concerned Scientists webinar on the tipping point, or how 2016 will shape California's water future. My name is Adrienne Alvord, and I'm the California and Western States Director at UCS. I will provide an introduction that will review the water policy landscape over the last few years, as well as why UCS chose to get involved in the issue of climate and water, and outline why the approach to water we currently use needs to change. Then my colleague, Dr. Juliet Christian-Smith, UCS's California Climate Science, who specializes in water issues, will explain in depth what are the areas of decision-making this year that present a tipping point for critical opportunities to change the way we approach water management. Dr. Christian-Smith will outline the risks we run if we don't start looking at water management through a climate science lens, and also the opportunities for better management if we do. Previous UC Water webinars were fairly technical in nature, in particular regarding groundwater management. Today's webinar is more focused on general policy and management choices and requirements. First, some housekeeping. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers. Make sure the volume is on. If you're having trouble with your computer audio, you can use your phone to dial in. Please be aware that we have a limited number of phone lines. And of course, you can use the chat box on the side of the screen to ask questions. Water management in California has been contentious for over a century, with different interests competing for water resources in an arid state. The primary controversies have been about where and to whom to allocate water resources to accommodate a large and growing population and a highly diverse economy that includes the richest agricultural production in the United States, along with the megacities that have grown up in highly arid regions of Southern California. Stresses on water systems have also brought challenges to preserving aquatic ecosystems and sufficient supplies for fishing, recreation, tribal rights, and local communities. The picture you see is of the Los Angeles Aqueduct, which carries water 250 miles from the Owens Valley in East Central California to the city of Los Angeles. The vast majority of this competition for water has been over surface water supplies. California, along with other Western states, built a system in the 20th century that was designed to capture winter snowmelt and precipitation in one of the state's approximately 1,300 reservoirs, and then convey the water through a system of canals, pipes, and pumps to agricultural and urban users. Groundwater use, though an important component of state water supplies, has been largely unregulated outside of a few adjudicated basins, mostly in Southern California. Groundwater has often been the fallback supply when surface water supplies are stressed in dry years. Both surface and groundwater supplies have been severely stressed during the drought we have experienced in California that began in 2011 and led to dramatically reduced surface water deliveries. This resulted in unprecedented groundwater pumping to make up for reduced surface water, leading to massive groundwater withdrawals and land subsidence, especially in the agricultural areas of the San Joaquin Valley. As the water crisis deepened, the state legislature for the first time passed a comprehensive groundwater law in 2014. While the timeline is unusually long to meet the requirements of the legislation, with full implementation not complete until 2040, this law was the first time that the state was required to create rules or controls on statewide groundwater use. Another consequence of the drought that occurred in 2014 was the passage of a water bond for roughly $7.5 billion by a vote on statewide Proposition 1. One of the primary drivers to pass the bond, which was approved by over a two-thirds vote of the people, was the desire to provide water infrastructure that would help ease the drought and prevent future shortages. Neither the water bond nor the groundwater law made specific mention of the need for new approaches to managing surface and groundwater due to climate change. But scientists have said that the historically unprecedented severity of the drought is linked to climate change. As Stanford scientists Noah Diffenbaugh and Chris Field noted in a September 2015 New York Times editorial, California is facing a new climate reality in which extreme drought is more likely. The state's water rights, infrastructure, and management were designed for an old climate, one that no longer exists. The Union of Concerned Scientists has long been involved in climate change research, education, and policy in California. Much of our work focuses on climate mitigation, especially in the transportation and energy sectors. But we also pioneered the first state climate assessment of climate impacts in California back in the year 2000. In recent years, our national work has been more focused on climate impacts and preparedness, with a focus on sea level rise and flooding in East Coast states and wildfire in the Intermountain West. As we considered a fresh approach to climate impacts in California, it was clear that water resources management was going to be hugely impacted by climate, and that water managers at the state level were not necessarily incorporating the science of climate change into their infrastructure and management decisions, despite a wealth of good scientific information. We believe UCS's unique combination of science and advocacy can add value in this space. 2 years ago, we were very fortunate to bring on Dr. Juliet Christian Smith to direct our climate and water work. Juliet went to work immediately to help us lay out a strategy for the primary water challenges that California faces in a changing climate. In that time, Juliet produced a white paper on groundwater to inform state legislators debating the groundwater law in 2014. She was also lead author on a letter signed by 50 distinguished state scientists who specialize in water on the need for state groundwater regulations, and she published an editorial in the Sacramento Bee, co-authored by a California farmer in support of the law, as well as helping to negotiate and advocate for the law's passage. Since the groundwater law passed in 2014, she produced a report on how the water sector can contribute to reducing emissions through clean energy investments, but the majority of her work has been in two areas: implementation of the groundwater law and promoting the understanding of how climate science needs to inform water infrastructure and management decision-making. Up to now, most planners and project designers have relied on existing data and past experience to help guide their decisions. With climate change, we need to rely on science and projections that include uncertainty and risk, because we can no longer rely on the past to be a guide to the future. Science is not perfect. For example, many climate models and published studies have actually not anticipated how quickly and severely projected impacts would occur. But science and climate modeling is improving, and it's the best tool we have. The problem is how to use it. We do not lack for scientific data. In fact, we have lots of science. California completed its third climate impacts assessment in 2012, and the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and National Climate Assessment both published exhaustive, updated reports on climate in 2014. Increasingly, local governments are turning to local university science to help educate them on what climate change will mean in their areas. But while California has great science and scientists, they are not often in a position to advocate for actually using the science. State policy and most Californians now acknowledge that climate change is real, and we have policies to help mitigate its impacts. But existing planning cultures and a lack of professional training and education for planners, along with readily available science that is comprehensible and useful to practitioners, have all been among the barriers to ensuring that the science is used effectively in water planning and infrastructure decisions. Meanwhile, these NASA images from outer space demonstrate that we are rapidly losing water. In fact, we are among the 3 regions in the world where we're most rapidly drawing down our water supplies. This NASA image shows both surface and groundwater. We need to act, and act soon. To highlight what can happen when climate science is ignored in water management decisions, Juliet published 3 pieces on what she called climate-water disconnects earlier this year. One example was the $6.4 billion construction of the eastern span of the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, pictured on the top left. 2 years after the completion of the project, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission found that sea level rise is expected to permanently inundate several areas of the new span and recommended several million dollars in new construction, public dollars that could be saved if the bridge's designers had incorporated climate science. Another egregious example occurred in 2014 at Lake Mendocino, pictured on the right, near Ukiah in Northern California, where the Federal Army Corps of Engineers, following guidance that hadn't been updated since 1959, released millions of gallons of water based on outdated scheduling, despite the fact that reservoir levels had fallen dramatically and we were in the middle of an unprecedented drought. Another ongoing example is when the State Commission charged with overseeing $2.7 billion in state water bond funds for water infrastructure projects initially failed to explicitly consider whether proposed water projects would work under future conditions, which climate science tells us will be quite different than in the past. More recently, the Commission incorporated some future projections, but as Juliet will detail shortly, these rules fell decades short of looking at future conditions over the lifetime of these new projects. The science on how climate change will impact water tells us that assumptions about when, where, and how precipitation will fall are changing and will continue to change, with dramatic and even potentially catastrophic results if we do not reduce global emissions dramatically. We are going to see more precipitation fall as rain and less as snow in California, which means we will need to rethink our historic strategy of relying on spring snowmelt to fill reservoirs and provide surface water in summer and fall dry season months. There is increasing likelihood and frequency of what up to now have been considered extreme events, both wet and dry. We are going to be increasingly dependent on groundwater supplies that we can store in wet years and pump out in dry years. This phenomenon will require careful planning so that we can be prepared for new conditions. UCS is not approaching these questions from a sectoral standpoint. We do not look at water management through the lens of what might be needed for agricultural, urban, or environmental users of water. Rather, we're trying to highlight how climatic change will impact all uses and what some of the new criteria need to be for making better choices. This year, California will be making a decision on water infrastructure and management that will have an impact for decades to come, which Juliet will discuss in detail. The question is whether these decisions will turn into more examples of expensive, risky disconnects, or whether they will truly serve the water needs of the state as conditions change. We hope you will join us in ensuring good science is being used to make good decisions, that these decisions are made with transparency and can be reviewed by the public, and that the current rules that we have create these climate water disconnects are changed and reflect the new reality. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Juliet Christian-Smith.
Thank you, Adrienne, and thank you everyone who's joining us online and by phone. A tipping point is the critical point in a process or system beyond which a significant and often unstoppable change takes place. Here are a few of the reasons why this year, 2016, is a tipping point for water. First, as Adrienne discussed, the impacts of climate change. After 4 years of exceptional drought, we're entering into what is projected to be an exceptionally wet year. Climate change impacts can be seen in real time, leading to an unprecedented decision-making environment where the past is much less helpful in understanding the present and is not helpful in planning for the future. Secondly, the regulation of groundwater. After a century of treating groundwater like an unlimited resource, the consequences of our groundwater depletion are being seen across the state, from land sinking in the Central Valley to valuable coastal aquifers becoming saline due to seawater intrusion. A new law requires more sustainable groundwater management, and this year, state water regulators are writing critical rules that will set the bar for what sustainability means in practice. And thirdly, the water bond. After 6 years of political wrangling, we finally have new financial resources to update California's water system to make it more resilient and reliable. This year, state water regulators are writing the regulations that will govern how a large chunk of this money will be spent. For more than a century, California has relied on its snowmelt-fed reservoirs, rivers, and streams for the majority of its water. But drought and climate change are depleting those traditional supplies. Here we see the chief of the California Snow Survey program pointing to a mark on the snowpack measuring pole that was the lowest previous snowpack level, as Governor Brown and the director of the Department of Water Resources look on. This was near Echo Summit, California on Wednesday, April 1st of 2015. And you can see they're standing in a dry brown grass meadow with no snow. The drought reduced surface water supplies, leading many people to shift to groundwater sources. Indeed, half of our water came from groundwater during the drought, with severe consequences for local groundwater levels. As this graphic shows, in just 1 year, groundwater levels declined by around 10 feet in much of the northern Central Valley and as much as 60 feet in some areas of the southern Central Valley. We've been documenting this shift and produced a fact sheet called the Big Water Supply Shift that describes how groundwater is key to water security in California's changing climate. Sustainable groundwater management can help protect California from both severe droughts and severe floods. And you can download this from our website at ucsusa.org/water-supply-shift. One of the things that has hampered water management in the past is our understanding of the system. As many of you are familiar with the hydrologic cycle, and this image is probably very familiar to you, you might not be as aware of the fact that we have been managing this system with very little information about half of it. Just this last year, Governor Brown and the legislature made well logs public for the first time. And so that means in the first time in the state's history, we will know where wells are and how deep they've been drilled. And this will give us some information about groundwater flows and water tables, empirical information that will then be required to be collected annually and reported in new groundwater sustainability plans that are required by the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which many of us lovingly refer to as SGMA. SGMA was passed in 2014, and it was a historic step towards more sustainable groundwater management, the first requirement for comprehensive groundwater measurement and management in California. But like most legislation, the Act is very high level, and many of the details of implementation are going to be worked out by state water regulators this year. In the past, I've described SGMA as a groundwater GPS. And essentially, this cartoon boils down the almost 50-page Act into one slide. The folks in the car are listening to their GPS tell them that they have arrived at an exciting destination, which happens to be straight off the edge of a cliff. In many ways, groundwater management up until this point has been a bit like this. A lot of nice-sounding objectives, but not enough specificity to avoid driving many groundwater tables off of the cliff. The box at the bottom reads why you need to be specific with a GPS. And the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act requires this specificity by asking groundwater basins to be managed with a very specific destination in mind, that being sustainable yield, or the level of groundwater pumping that can occur without harming human uses or ecosystem uses. It also steers us clear of dangerous cliffs, cliffs like the undesirable results that are listed in the law. These include chronic lowering of groundwater levels, land subsidence or sinking, seawater intrusion into coastal aquifers, degradation of water quality, and depletion of surface water that's connected to groundwater systems. Finally, the Act requires a clear map explaining how groundwater basins will get to their destination. These are groundwater sustainability plans. And these plans have to track the speed at which they're traveling. The first groundwater sustainability plan is due in 2020 for many basins, with multiple subsequent updates. One of the ways of thinking about this is that a groundwater plan now has to give the specific coordinates of where a groundwater basin is headed. And if those coordinates are off or look like they may drive a basin off of a cliff, the state can take the wheel. And this is often referred to as the state backstop. The state can actually step in and start managing groundwater basins as soon as next year, in 2017, if they are unable to establish appropriate local agencies. This year, the state is writing the rules for how the maps or the groundwater sustainability plans should be made. These rules will both tell the local groundwater agencies what they need to include in their plans and how the state will evaluate the adequacy of plans that they submit. In many ways, this sets the bar for what sustainability will mean in practice. Because groundwater flows between counties and local jurisdictions, but is essentially a shared resource, like a street or highway, the regulations could help avoid chaos by presenting a clear framework that sets up some minimum requirements. For instance, speed limits that don't change from county to county. Or, on the other hand, unclear regulations could lead to chaos, essentially more of the same, where everyone looks out for their own interest, leading to a collective traffic jam. to understand how local agencies might develop effective groundwater sustainability plans and to inform the regulations currently under development, here at the UCS we authored a report called Measuring What Matters, which provides a review of the state of knowledge and practice related to designing sustainable groundwater management systems. And it draws on examples from other states and countries. The Union of Concerned Scientists, in partnership with the California Water Foundation, convened a multi-stakeholder roundtable to inform the report's findings. The roundtable met twice last summer and involved voices from counties, water suppliers, academics, agriculture, underrepresented communities, and environmental interests throughout California. And based on this dialogue, we developed the following conclusions and recommendations for the state's approach to defining and evaluating groundwater sustainability plans. First, there needs to be a common framework for setting thresholds and interim milestones. This framework must rely on state standards and policies where they exist and create common rules and methodology where there are no state standards and the basins have a great deal of flexibility. Secondly, identify existing data sources for basin conditions. The state has an important role to play in identifying where to find data to be used in groundwater sustainability plans and could lead efforts to improve groundwater data and monitoring networks where gaps or inconsistencies currently exist. In order to treat all basins fairly, the state should require basins have access to some consistent data when assessing their groundwater conditions over time, and also require consistent assumptions to develop sustainable yield. The Act requires that groundwater basins achieve a sustainable yield by 2040. And since that's so far ahead of us, most basins will use models to project how changing land and water uses, management approaches, and other factors like climate change will affect the basin's water budget. Because assumptions drive modeling efforts, it will be critical for the state to define common assumptions for use when developing sustainable yield. And finally, developing common metrics and consistent data management and reporting protocols. Local agencies need state guidance to ensure that basins are using the same information and the same measurement units to describe undesirable results and report information in a manner that will support cooperative interbasin and intrabasin communication and coordination, as well as to protect all basin water users. So there are some important decisions and opportunities for involvement ahead. The draft regulations for what will be included in the groundwater sustainability plans will be published in the coming weeks. The Department of Water Resources will present these draft regulations to the California Water Commission, potentially at their February 17th meeting. And there will be a public opportunity for public testimony and an opening for public comment once those regulations become available. Now I'm going to shift from discussing the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act to the water bond. You might remember this commercial that featured the governor urging voters to approve Proposition 1, the water bond that passed in 2014. This year, state water regulators are writing the rules for how some of that money will be spent. The bond earmarks $2.7 billion for water infrastructure projects. This includes the above-ground surface storage that you see here, and also below-ground groundwater recharge projects. These projects tend to be long-lived, with some having lifespans of over 100 years. The Union of Concerned Scientists is interested in ensuring that water infrastructure projects that the public pays for today will deliver tomorrow. And we want to encourage a resilient and reliable water system that can withstand more severe conditions that are more likely due to climate change. We have a couple of concerns with the way that the California Water Commission has been discussing climate change in their working draft regulations. First, the draft regulations freeze climate change at 2050, meaning that after 2050, they will assume no changes and that conditions will remain the same, despite climate projections that indicate that conditions are likely to significantly worsen after mid-century. Even in cases where a project has an expected lifespan well beyond 2050, The working draft regulations do not require any analysis of how conditions may change after mid-century. In addition, the Commission has discussed using a median approach. This is not a true statistical median, but a scenario that returns results that are in the middle of the road, not particularly hot or cold, not particularly wet or dry. And in some cases, we do want a middle-of-the-road approach to planning. But when we are risk-averse, we often choose more precautionary approaches that will prepare us for more severe conditions. For example, the way we prepare for earthquakes in infrastructure, planning, and development. The rationale for using a middle-of-the-road approach was that climate projections introduce too much complexity and uncertainty. However, we have been able to proactively manage earthquake uncertainty successfully in California by requiring buildings to be able to withstand severe seismic activity, despite a limited understanding or a great amount of uncertainty around where, when the next earthquake will hit, or with what force. An example of this is the 1906 San Francisco earthquake in comparison to the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. In 1906, the San Francisco earthquake had a 7.9 magnitude and resulted in 700 to 800 deaths, destroying over 28,000 buildings. This is a view from Union Square. This is Stockton Street looking towards Market. Here is the same viewpoint in Union Square looking towards Market Street in 1989, right after the Loma Prieta earthquake hit, which had a 6.9 magnitude. In this case, you can see there's debris in the streets, but a limited number of structures were damaged, and they were damaged primarily due to soil liquefaction. In addition, the quake was responsible for only 63 deaths. Most fatalities were the result of the collapse of a freeway in Oakland that was built in the 1950s, before building codes required all structures be designed to withstand violent seismic forces. We will be submitting public comments and providing public testimony. And if you share the Union of Concerned Scientists' concerns related to incorporating the best available science, we urge you to write the Water Commission and if possible come to the meeting on February 17th. You can see that in 2 days, this Friday, January 29th, the draft regulations will be published, and we will provide a link to that in an email we will send to everyone who RSVP'd to this webinar. On February 17th, the California Water Commission will actually be meeting and discussing the draft regulations, and March 14th is the end of the public comment period. The regulations will then go to the Office of Administrative Law for final review. We're happy to provide more background and information to you offline individually. If you're interested in learning more or considering how to get involved, please sign up for our Tipping Point series. This is a new communication tool that will provide you with time-sensitive alerts and information as crucial decision points approach. You can sign up automatically to receive these updates at the link below, feeds.feedburner.com/California Tipping Points. We're also sending a link in the chat box that you can simply click on to sign up now. This morning, we've been discussing some of the important decisions that are being made this year that will shape California's water future for many years to come. Historically, these decisions have not been made with much involvement of the scientific community or much public scrutiny. In fact, at many of the meetings I attend, there are only a dozen or so people present. We want to help change this by informing experts and engaged Californians about the opportunities to get involved in the conversation. It's going to be a busy year. We're working to tip the scales in the favor of science and democracy, and would love to partner with you. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'd like to turn it over to the moderator to take your questions.
If you would like to register your question, please press star followed by 1 on your telephone keypad. If your question has been answered and you would like to withdraw your registration, please press the pound key. One moment please for the first question. Ladies and gentlemen, as a reminder, to register for an audio question, press star followed by the 1. There are no questions at this time.
Okay, well, we have some questions in the chat box. Um, so first, and I'm going to aggregate these by general interest. So first, there's a question about UCS's role in what we will be advocating for. So Juliet, I think maybe this is a good question for you. What are we going to be advocating for? What's our role?
Sure, I can start, and Adrienne can definitely jump in. In general, we are focused on ensuring that the best science is used in decision-making processes, and that decision-making processes that are preparing us or making public investments in the future use the science that is available that indicates that the future will be very different from the past. We're also interested in increasing transparency and allowing the public to review information and decisions in a transparent and accessible manner. So we're always working on both of those fronts.
I see a couple of specific questions here. One about the role of UCS in terms of urban sprawl and new water demands. And again, UCS, despite the fact that this is obviously a very important question, as is the question of agricultural demand and ecosystem demand, we're not so much looking at these issues from a sectoral standpoint as we are from an overall approach that incorporates science so we can understand better how the water system works. And obviously that will have consequences down the line in terms of how we allocate water. But at this point we think it's most important to promote education and incorporation of science by policymakers and practitioners so that they're in a position to make the best decisions. And then I think the sectoral conversations will continue as they have for as long as we've been a state on how we should best allocate water.
Great. We're getting a lot of questions now. We've got a question from Jody Cook. How is rainwater capture by individuals, organizations, or municipalities factored into groundwater policy recommendations by UCS?
So the use of rainwater and floodwaters to recharge the ground is very central to our approach to both getting the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act passed and to our involvement in the discussions around the water bond. So as our fact sheet, the Big Water Supply Shift described, and as Adrienne described, using groundwater strategically to refill it when we have wet periods and ensure that we're not using too much when we have dry periods is central to our ability to adapt to climate changes that are at this point unavoidable. So we're involved in thinking about how rainwater can be used better, and there's a lot of interesting new research going on right now with University of California, Davis and Sustainable Conservation on actually recharging groundwater on active farmlands. So I think it's an area of growing interest.
Great. And then there is something of a follow-up question, although I think asked separately, about how much, it says, I've read that farmers are trying to flood fields to increase groundwater, roughly using this method in the rain season. What are the percentages lost to evaporation, to evapotranspiration, and saved in the ground?
So I would have to suggest that that person read this recent report. I believe one of the authors was Thomas Harder. I'm sure you can find it on at the UC Davis website or Sustainable Conservation's website about their work in the Central Valley.
Great. So this is a question on SGMA, and then maybe we'll go back and check the phone lines. is there any hope that the area covered by a GSA can be extended to the watershed feeding the groundwater basin instead of the more narrow Bulletin 118 area?
Right. So that's really a question of people who are interested in some of the headwaters and the sources of water that are eventually used typically on the valley floors, but are sometimes used in the headwaters as well. The way that the Department of Water Resources has defined groundwater basins is really the flatlands, the alluvial valleys. And that is that's one particular definition that has changed over time. And I think there's certainly an opportunity to discuss changing it in the future, although that decision is not up. There's not kind of a policy decision-making process going on immediately, but it could be part of work on the California Water Plan that is ongoing for the next several years.
Great. So we do have a lot more questions in the chat box, but let's go to the moderator and see if we've got any on the phone.
Ladies and gentlemen, as a reminder, to register for an audio question, press star followed by the 1. At this time, there are no questions.
Okay, great. So we've got a couple of general questions. So first, let's start with this. Has UCS, or sorry, there are a lot of questions here. Someone is asking about their understanding that, is their understanding correct that once underground aquifers are depleted, they cannot be refilled? Can you address that, Juliet?
Yes. So land subsidence or land sinking, it's like a sponge. If you have a wet sponge, it's bigger, and if you squeeze out all the water, it becomes smaller. And what's happening is that the pore spaces are collapsing, and that's exactly what happens underground. So once you've lost that storage space, if it's inelastic land subsidence, which most of the land subsidence we've seen is, then you can't refill it. The pore space is gone, so the soil is actually compacted in a way that it won't be able to be refilled later.
Great, thank you. Here's a good question from Robin Lee, and this might be Juliet or Adrian. Do you have a way to make science more relevant to decision makers over corporate and people's emotional needs?
Juliet, do you want to start or should I?
I think you should.
Okay. Well, here at UCS we actually spend a great deal of time not only communicating with policymakers but also studying communications and trying to understand how we can make highly complex topics more relevant. And this usually has to do, particularly with policymakers, elected policymakers, with the impacts on their constituents and what it means for them. So we have done a lot of specific looking at what's going on in different parts of the state and try to approach elected policymakers through that lens. The water community is very large in California, and it's already split between several sectors, as I've mentioned. And these sectors are pretty powerful. But I think because of the fact that we're looking at this not through a question of who should get what, in other words, we don't have, we're not self-interested in this in a sense. We just want to make sure that all of the rules are made in a way that takes the best possible information into account. I think that gives us unique credibility. Science is still seen as a highly credible voice by polls reinforce that all the time. So that does give us a leg up. We obviously, like most nonprofits, we don't have the same level of resources as some of the other stakeholders. But what we found is that continually going and testifying about what the data says over time has a powerful impact. So I think it's a combination of trying to appeal to the self-interest of policymakers and coming to them with the best possible data. It's not easy, sometimes takes a while, but we've had a lot of results over the years, and so I think that's what we'll continue to do. One thing I should say, though, is that more voices in this space are really needed, and that's one of the purposes of doing this webinar. We really would like to see more people advocating on behalf of good science and the fact that we need to prepare for a different future than what we've seen in the past.
Great. So here's a question about SGMA, the Groundwater Management Act. I've heard that, this is from Brian Schmidt, I've heard the Southern Central Valley jurisdictions are having trouble getting organized to select a groundwater management agency, the first step under SGMA. What can you tell us about this and whether they'll be pressured to move forward?
Sure, I'll take that one. And if you sign up to our Tipping Point series, I will be doing a blog about this with links to the Department of Water Resources has a site where it shows all of the proposed groundwater sustainability agencies. And so the Southern Central Valley is not alone. The Northern Central Valley has multiple local agencies that have claimed, have sent in forms saying that they'd like to be the local groundwater sustainability agency, and they have overlapping boundaries. So they have a lot of people that want to do it, and they're going to have to choose one. In general, I think this is definitely an institutional challenge, and designing effective groundwater sustainability agencies will be another whole set of questions. Luckily, the Berkeley BOLT, the Berkeley Law Institute, the Center for Law, Energy, and Environment, and the UC Water Security and Sustainability Research Initiative are coming out with a report in the coming weeks that will be all about how to design groundwater sustainability agencies that work. So it's not just a scientific challenge, it's a governance challenge. And it's important that locally, if you want to be involved, you can check this Department of Water Resources map and see who in your area is asking to become a groundwater sustainability agency. And they're required to have public notice, and they're required to have public meetings at the point of which, at the point that they want to form. So it's another opportunity for public engagement, and I think some of the mapping tools will help people be able to link into that locally.
Great. So there have been some questions around not necessarily the quantity of water, but the quality of water, how the quality of our soil affects groundwater, and how much attention is being paid to the quality versus the quantity of water. In particular, water quality in aquifers. There have been some questions about using chemicals or restricting chemicals to clean up the water. Can you speak to that concern, Juliet?
Sure. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act addresses the degradation of water quality. So it's one of the undesirable results that groundwater sustainability agencies and groundwater basins need to avoid. That being said, my assumption is that the regulations that come out in the coming weeks about groundwater sustainability plans will really refer to existing water quality statutes, the Porter Cologne Act, Clean Water Act, and their requirements for drinking water and surface water quality. We'll see if the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is used as another tool to improve water quality, or if it will just uphold existing statutes.
Great.
And I think that actually kind of links into a related question around how we think the regulatory agencies will set the bar for sustainability. And again, it's a bit of a projection at this point because we haven't seen the regulations. But if, for instance, the questioner asks, if a GSP fails to consider the effects of climate change, do you think regulators will bounce it back to them? And that is exactly why we're trying to encourage a great amount of clarity up front, because if it's clear that incorporating climate change is a requirement, and if it's even clearer that there are going to be specific scenarios that are developed by DWR or that are going to be described with sufficient clarity that individual groundwater basins can model those same scenarios, then it will be be much easier to see when a basin has complied with the requirements or when they have failed to comply with the requirements.
Great. So we've got a question about how the agency will determine that some areas are low priority or very low priority groundwater areas.
Again, that's one I'm going to have to leave to the Department of Water Resources. That's part of their process in implementing the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and those are a series of regulations that they'll be coming out with at a later date than the Groundwater Sustainability Plan regulations that are coming out in the next few weeks.
Great. We've got a question here. What is a good response to those who say California doesn't have a drought problem, it has a storage problem? More reservoirs don't equate to more water supply, correct?
Adrienne, do you want to take that one?
Well, that is correct. More storage doesn't equate to more water supply because the system that we have is designed, as we said, for precipitation patterns that are changing. And so even if we get plenty of water this year, most of the science indicates that it probably won't be enough to ameliorate our drought. And I think the idea is that somehow if we had more reservoirs to catch this, that we'd somehow be in better shape. But we can't fill the reservoirs we already have. So what we really need to do is take a look at how the patterns are changing and plan for new precipitation. And I think most experts agree that because of increasing heat, surface water storage is problematic for two reasons. One is, again, these historic patterns are shifting, but another reason is that with increasing heat, there's more evaporation from surface water, and it's actually better to store the water underground. It's actually a great deal of water that can evaporate, and we can't afford to lose it. So, water storage is something that we've relied upon for over 100 years, and it has served us well. And I understand that it's something. A lot of times people think if something is good, that more is better. But in this case, under changing conditions, we can't store water that doesn't come to us. So that's what we're going to have to be thinking about over the next several decades. Juliet, do you want to add to that?
I think that's a good summary. The main shift we see is in temperature, and the temperature affects the kind of precipitation we'll get. So a shift from snow to rain, and a snow-dominated storage system is going to have less and less snow to store, and so that's something that we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that reservoir reoperation, new ways of designing surface storage and groundwater storage.
Great. An answer to all of the questions about whether these slides will be online. We will post a recording of the webinar online by Friday, and if you subscribe to the Tipping Points series, you should get that directly to your email. Otherwise, you should look out for an email on Friday with the link to find those. So we've got a couple of questions here about where GSAs overlap. So where they overlay separate parts of the same groundwater basin, who oversees the coordination, and how can they best negotiate their boundaries when aquifers can be connected over vast regions?
So this year, in 2015, or at the end of last year, new legislation was passed. It was the Senate Bill 13, and it included a bunch of quote-unquote cleanup legislation for the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And in that bill, they clarified that if a groundwater sustainability agency has overlapping boundaries with another, they will both be invalid. And so this is really going to put the pressure on locals to work together, because first they have to know what each other is doing and ensure that they're not overlapping, but also if they have competing interests or competing proposals, that they really will need to locally decide on one or some kind of hybrid of the agencies that are interested. One thing that I will note is that the Department of Water Resources has provided funding for local facilitation, and you can apply for that funding online in order to get some professional help for the facilitation and mediation and negotiation that is going to need to occur in many places to choose a groundwater sustainability agency.
Great. So we've got a couple of questions about sort of how we will be sharing our research on this and other water topics. And I think unless you've got more to add, Juliet, I think the best thing if you want to stay updated on these topics is to follow the Tipping Point blog series, and any new research or findings or updates that come out about this will be flagged in that blog. Do you have anything to add to that, Juliet?
I think that's a great way to get information from us. If there are specific things that you're interested in, like the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, there's also the Department of Water Resources has a page on that, and the California Water Commission has a page on the Water Storage Investment Program, or that $2.7 billion that they're allocating. Again, I'll be providing links to both of those in the Tipping Point series as I send updates out.
Great. So we've got another question relating to the concept of building more surface storage. Can you address the other impacts of that concept? We need resilient rivers and water ecosystems in a changing climate as well. 100 years of dams have made huge ecosystem impacts and economic impacts. What about the science of these environmental impact issues?
Adrian, do you want to take a first crack at it? Or?
Well, it's a science. It's a science question. Why don't you go ahead?
All right. Well, clearly there are aquatic scientists who have been looking at the impact of upstream dams on all sorts of things, from migrating salmon to the tiny insects that live in the bottom of river systems, macrobenthic invertebrates, macroinvertebrates. And there's a lot of science that suggests that changing the sediment regime, the water quality, the water temperature, the water timing, and the flow can significantly alter aquatic species habitats. And I myself am a climate scientist. I'm not an aquatic biologist, but there's clearly a lot of interest in ensuring that water storage projects in the future either mitigate for past environmental harms or do not do further damage. And this is actually another piece of the regulations that people are tracking, which is ensuring that the public funding that is provided through the water bond and the water storage portion of the bond is not used to pay for existing environmental mitigation compliance requirements. So for instance, complying with the Endangered Species Act to ensure that endangered species aren't jeopardized or killed due to water project operations.
Great. And then I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Is there anyone on the phone waiting to ask a question?
Ladies and gentlemen, as a reminder, to register for an audio question, press star followed by the 1. At this time, there are no questions.
Great. So we've got a question about what are the best ways for PhD students studying various water aspects to go about advocating for good science and preparing for a different future, as previously mentioned?
Well, that's a great question. You know, I think it can be difficult in academia to always get the applied side of the equation. So one of the things we have at the Union of Concerned Scientists is a fellowship program. It's called the Kendall Fellowship that brings in early career scientists, PhD candidates or PhD recipients to apply their technical specialized research to current policy problems. In addition, we have expanded another program, another fellowship with the Goldman Public Policy School to bring in fellows who are graduating with their Masters of Public Policy. And we're always open to collaborating with students on their research and thinking about how to communicate their research to other audiences besides academics.
If I could add to that, we are happy to provide information that can help direct students to specific questions, particularly happening at the local and statewide level. And we also have a science network that is open to scientists, engineers, and economists who have a master's level degree or above. For those who want to join us and get more involved in some of these questions, it could be anything from just staying more informed via the emails that we send out or the other informational publications that we send out, to being involved in letters to the editor or testimony or providing public information on these questions using their expertise. So pardoning the self-promotion, UCS does provide several options, but if people are interested in how they can do more in their local communities, we can try to help.
Great, and that is all the time we have. There are, I see, still many questions. I think we will, since this is all the time we have, if you have questions you'd like answered, please feel free to email us. You can either email me, Corinne, I've been helping to moderate, at cweintraub@ucsusa.org, or you can, well, I was going to say you can email Juliet or Adrian. Is that okay to put your emails out as well?
Please. Sure.
Okay, great. I'll send these emails in the chat box, and please feel free to contact us there. Thank you so much for your participation and questions. And again, the webinar will be available online.